March 6, 1944. Debden Airfield, Essex, England. Major James Howard's hands moved across the radio panel of P-51B Mustang, serial number 43-12434, as Ground Crew Chief Master Sergeant Robert Chen watched with professional curiosity. 4 crystal control channels, 50-mile range, voice clarity like a telephone call. Every single Mustang carries this. Chen had spent the morning examining captured Luftwaffe FUG-16ZY radio equipment pulled from a downed FW-190 the previous week. The German system was functional, adequate even, but comparing it to the SCR-522 installation before him felt like comparing a Model T to a Packard. The American system occupied roughly the same space behind the pilot's seat, weighed approximately the same 60 pounds, but the engineering philosophy differed fundamentally. The SCR-522 featured 4 pre-selected VHF channels, allowing instant switching between frequencies, automatic noise suppression circuits, and most critically, voice transmission quality so clear that pilots could recognize individual squadron mates by voice alone at ranges exceeding 50 miles. The German equipment offered none of these advantages. Single-channel operation, high-frequency band susceptible to atmospheric interference, range limited to perhaps 30 miles under ideal conditions. And most telling, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine emphasized radio silence during combat operations to avoid Allied direction finding, meaning German pilots often fought in enforced communication blackout. This wasn't a minor technical difference. This was a fundamental gap in combat capability that transformed how American fighter pilots fought the air war over Europe. While Luftwaffe pilots relied on visual signals and pre-brief tactics, American pilots talked constantly, sharing threat information, coordinated attacks, calling for help, adapting strategies in real time based on developing situations. The P-51 Mustang's reputation as an exceptional fighter rested not just on its Packard-built Merlin engine and laminar flow wing, but on a communications advantage that turned individual aircraft into nodes in a coordinated network. The implications would become clear that very afternoon, when the 354th Fighter Group escorted B-17 bombers to Berlin for the first time, and Luftwaffe Major Heinz Knoke watched American fighters swarm his formation with coordination that seemed impossible. The journey to this technological advantage had begun 3 years earlier when the United States Army Air Forces identified tactical radio communication as a critical capability gap in modern air combat. In late 1941, the Signal Corps issued specifications for a new VHF radio system that would provide reliable voice communication at extended ranges, with multiple pre-selected channels for tactical flexibility. The resulting SCR-522 entered production in early 1943, manufactured primarily by RCA and Western Electric, with initial units delivered to fighter squadrons by mid-1943. The P-51 Mustang first entered combat with the Royal Air Force in May 1942, powered by the Allison V-1710 engine and serving primarily in tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles. These early Mustangs carried British radio equipment, functional but limited. The transformative moment came when the Mustang airframe met the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, creating the P-51B variant that first flew in December 1942. North American Aviation designed the P-51B with the SCR-522 installation as standard equipment from the beginning, recognizing that long-range escort missions over enemy territory required reliable communication between widely dispersed fighters. The first P-51B Mustangs arrived in England in November 1943, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group based at Boxted. On December 1, 1943, the group flew its first combat mission, a fighter sweep over the French coast near St. Omer. The mission profile was unremarkable. 24 Mustangs departed Boxted at 13:45, crossed the channel at 20,000 feet, swept the target area for 35 minutes without encountering enemy aircraft, and returned to base by 1620 with all aircraft accounted for. What made the mission historically significant wasn't the tactical outcome, but the operational methodology. Throughout the mission, flight leaders maintained constant radio contact with their wingmen, with group commanders, and with sector control back in England. Pilots reported weather conditions, navigation fixes, and potential threats in clear, intelligible transmissions. When Captain James Brooks experienced rough engine operation at 1510 and requested permission to abort, the entire group heard his transmission, watched him turn for home, and adjusted formation spacing accordingly, all without visual signals or breaking radio silence. This operational pattern, constant communication, shared situational awareness, coordinated response to developing situations, represented a fundamental departure from previous fighter operations where radio silence was considered tactically essential. The SCR-522's excellent voice quality and reliable performance at extended ranges made this new doctrine practical. The first major test came on December 13, 1943, when the 354th Fighter Group escorted B-17 bombers attacking Kiel, Germany. At approximately 11:30, while the bombers conducted their attack run from 25,000 feet, Luftwaffe Bf-109 fighters attacked from the rear quarter. Group Commander Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Martin immediately broadcast a threat warning. "Bandits, 6 o'clock high, coming down." Every Mustang pilot in the formation heard the warning simultaneously, executed defensive maneuvers, and repositioned for counterattack within seconds. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. The 304th claimed 4 Bf-109s destroyed without loss. Not because American pilots were individually superior to their German opponents, but because coordinated response to the initial threat prevented the Luftwaffe attack from achieving surprise. German pilot Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, who survived the engagement, later described the experience in his memoir. "The American fighters reacted to our attack before we completed our dive. They turned into us simultaneously, as though conducting a rehearsed maneuver. We expected confusion, separated fighters we could pick off individually. Instead, we faced coordinated defensive formation that forced us to break off." What Stigler didn't know, what no Luftwaffe pilot knew during this period, was that the simultaneous defensive response resulted from instantaneous voice communication warning every American pilot of the threat before visual contact. This capability transformed the fundamental dynamics of fighter combat. Through the winter of 1943-44, the pattern repeated across multiple engagements. On December 20, 1943, during an escort mission to Bremen, P-51s from the 354th Fighter Group detected Luftwaffe fighters assembling to attack the bomber formation. Flight leader Captain Don Bierbauer transmitted position and altitude information to his squadron, coordinated a high-low attack pattern, and directed specific flights to cut off German escape routes, all via radio while maneuvering at combat speed. The resulting engagement destroyed 6 German fighters against 1 P-51 lost. On January 5, 1944, over Kiel, American pilots used radio communication to execute the Thatch Weave defensive maneuver with precision impossible to achieve through visual signals alone. When Luftwaffe fighters attacked, threatened Mustang pilots called for help from their wingmen, who turned aggressively to position themselves on the attacker's tail, while the threatened pilot turned toward his wingman, creating a scissors pattern that presented German pilots with defensive fire from multiple angles simultaneously. The tactic, developed by U.S. Navy Commander John Thatch in 1942, required split-second timing and precise coordination. The SCR-522 radio made it practical in the chaos of high-speed combat.
On February 10, 1944, during Big Week operations targeting German aircraft production facilities, the 357th Fighter Group, newly equipped with P-51Bs, used radio communication to coordinate attacks against German fighters defending the FW-190 assembly plant at Brunswick. Group Commander Major Thomas Hayes directed flights to specific attack positions, warned pilots of threats developing behind them, and called for reinforcements when sections became heavily engaged. The group claimed 11 German fighters destroyed in an engagement involving more than 60 aircraft on both sides. German after-action reports described the American attack as highly coordinated and noted unusual tactical flexibility as American pilots adapted to developing situations in real time. From a Luftwaffe perspective, American fighter tactics seemed incomprehensibly sophisticated. German pilots, fighting under strict radio discipline that kept transmissions to absolute minimum, couldn't understand how American fighters maintained such precise coordination during fluid combat. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, commanding 3.JG-77, noted in his diary after an engagement on February 22, 1944, "The Americans fight as though they share one mind. They warn each other, coordinate attacks, respond to threats with impossible speed. Our pilots fight alone, relying on brief tactics and individual skill. Their pilots fight as teams with complete awareness of battlefield situation. The advantage stemmed entirely from the communications technology gap. While Luftwaffe pilots flew with FUG-16Z radios, theoretically capable of voice transmission, German tactical doctrine emphasized radio silence to avoid Allied direction finding and intelligence gathering. Transmissions were restricted to essential messages in brief, coded formats. American pilots, confident at Allied air superiority, made direction finding largely irrelevant, and using frequency hopping capabilities that complicated German intelligence efforts, talked constantly. By March 1944, 4 American fighter groups operated P-51 Mustangs in the European theater: the 354th, 357th, 4th, and 363rd, with more converting from P-47 Thunderbolts weekly. Every single Mustang carried the SCR-522 radio. Every mission began with radio checks. Every combat engagement featured continuous voice communication. American fighter pilots developed their own tactical language, concise calls that conveyed complex information instantly. Bounce meant enemy aircraft attacking from above. Break right meant immediate maximum performance turn to the right. Tally meant visual contact with enemy aircraft. Bingo meant fuel state required immediate return to base. This operational language, combined with reliable radio equipment, created what modern military theorists would call a force multiplier: technological and tactical integration that amplified the effectiveness of individual units beyond their raw capabilities. But the advantage depended entirely on one critical condition: the Germans not recognizing that American radio communications provided the coordination advantage and not developing effective countermeasures. That condition would not last forever.
But by mid-1944, Luftwaffe intelligence officers began piecing together the truth about American tactical radio use. The revelation came not through signals intelligence or captured equipment analysis, but through interrogation of captured American pilots. On April 8, 1944, Lieutenant Richard Stevens of the 357th Fighter Group was shot down over France by ground fire and captured by Wehrmacht forces. During interrogation at Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe transit camp for captured airmen near Frankfurt, Stevens described standard American fighter tactics in detail, including continuous radio communication throughout combat operations. The interrogating officer, Hauptmann Hans Scharf, noted in his report,
Pilot states American fighters maintain constant voice communication during combat. Flight leaders broadcast threat warnings. Pilots request assistance. Squadron commanders coordinate attacks via radio. All pilots monitor common frequency throughout engagement. The report reached Luftwaffe intelligence headquarters by April 15, 1944, where analysts cross-referenced it with other captured pilot interrogations and monitoring of American radio frequencies. The pattern became clear. American pilots used their radios not occasionally for essential communication, but constantly as their primary tactical coordination tool. This represented a fundamental philosophical difference from German doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Mitusch, a Luftwaffe fighter tactics officer, examined the intelligence and wrote an assessment that reached Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's desk by May 1944. American fighter coordination superiority stems from tactical radio communication. Their pilots share threat information continuously, warn each other of attacks, coordinate complex maneuvers via voice transmission. Our pilots fight under radio silence doctrine intended to prevent enemy direction finding. This gives Americans decisive informational advantage. They know what their comrades know. Our pilots know only what they personally observe. The Luftwaffe response was immediate, but ultimately ineffective. On May 20, 1944, new tactical directives authorized increased radio communication by German fighter pilots, particularly when facing coordinated American attacks. But the FUG-16Z equipment limitations remained. Single-channel operation, limited range, inferior voice quality, high static interference. German pilots who attempted to emulate American communication tactics discovered their equipment couldn't reliably support the doctrine. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke recorded his experience in his diary on June 15, 1944. New orders encourage radio communication to coordinate attacks against American fighters. Tried this approach during mission against bombers attacking Munich. Radio quality poor. Couldn't understand half of transmissions. Static interference when above 20,000 feet. Range insufficient to maintain contact when formation separated. Reverted to visual signals and pre-brief tactics. The Americans somehow maintained crystal clear communication at all altitudes and ranges. We cannot match this. American pilots remained largely unaware that their communication advantage had been identified. On June 22, Captain Charles Chuck Yeager of the 357th Fighter Group scored 5 kills in a single mission over Bremen, his first ace-in-a-day achievement. His combat report, filed after the mission, casually noted, "Received threat warning from Blue Leader about bandits at 3 o'clock high. Turned into them with my flight. Shot down 109 in initial pass. Called position of remaining bandits to squadron. Engaged second 109 with help from my wingman, who called when I had firing position. Shot down second 109. Similar pattern for remaining 3 kills. Squadron coordination excellent throughout engagement." The entire report, describing tactics that destroyed 5 German fighters in 8 minutes, treated radio communication as routine background capability rather than decisive advantage. To American pilots, talking during combat was simply how fighter operations worked. The concept of fighting in radio silence seemed archaic, a throwback to earlier aerial warfare eras. But from the German perspective, American radio communications created an almost insurmountable tactical problem. Hauptmann Günther Rahl, commanding II.JG-11 and one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, described the challenge in a post-war interview. "You could be an excellent pilot, have superior aircraft performance, execute perfect attack positioning. But the moment you committed to an attack run, every American fighter within radio range knew you were there. They didn't need to see you. Their comrades saw you and told them. You weren't fighting one pilot."
You were fighting everyone who could hear that pilot's radio. The technical examination of captured American equipment confirmed what interrogations had revealed. On July 7, 1944, Luftwaffe technical intelligence officers examined a P-51D shot down relatively intact near Paris. The SCR-522 was recovered undamaged. German engineers documented its specifications. 4-channel VHF operation with crystal-controlled frequency stability, automatic noise suppression, voice quality comparable to telephone communications, effective range exceeding 50 miles at operational altitudes. The report concluded, American system technically superior to FUG-16ZY in every measurable parameter. 4-channel capability particularly significant. Allows pre-selection of frequencies for different tactical purposes. Fighter pilots can switch instantly between squadron frequency, group frequency, air-sea rescue frequency, and command frequency without manual tuning. The implications were devastating. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to develop and produce an equivalent system. Even if such a system could be designed, equipping the Luftwaffe's remaining fighters would require months of production time that Germany simply didn't have by summer 1944. The communication advantage would remain an American monopoly through the war's end. The SCR-522's development traced back to specific requirements issued by the U.S. Army Air Forces in October 1941, following analysis of RAF combat experience during the Battle of Britain. The specification document, Signal Corps Requirements No. 522, outlined precise performance parameters. Voice transmission and reception at ranges exceeding 40 miles at 25,000 feet altitude. Operation in the very high frequency band 100 to 156 MHz to minimize atmospheric interference. Multiple pre-selected channels for tactical flexibility. Compatibility with standard oxygen mask microphones used by fighter pilots. Weight not exceeding 65 pounds, including antenna equipment. Volume not exceeding 3 cubic feet to fit standard fighter aircraft installation spaces. The strategic context driving these requirements centered on the emerging concept of long-range fighter escort for strategic bombers. Army Air Forces planners recognized that bomber formations attacking targets deep in enemy territory, potentially 500 miles or more from friendly bases, would require fighter escort operating at extreme ranges in hostile airspace. Coordinating multiple fighter squadrons across hundreds of square miles of sky while simultaneously managing bomber protection, attacking German fighters, and maintaining navigation to and from target areas demanded reliable, long-range radio communication as fundamental enabling technology. The Signal Corps assigned development responsibility to RCA Victor Division, which had extensive experience manufacturing commercial radio equipment. Lead engineer William Brown, who had previously designed VHF communication systems for commercial aviation, faced the impossible choice that defined military electronics development. Maximize performance within severe constraints of weight, volume, power consumption, and environmental durability. The mathematics were brutally simple. VHF radio transmission at 100-plus MHz frequencies required specific antenna lengths related to signal wavelength, roughly 18 inches for optimal efficiency. Fighter aircraft design allowed minimal antenna installation space. Brown's team had to choose between optimal antenna performance and practical installation constraints. They chose a compromise antenna design that sacrificed roughly 15% of theoretical maximum range for installation flexibility. Similarly, the choice of crystal-controlled 4-channel operation represented a trade-off between tactical flexibility and equipment complexity. A continuously tunable radio receiver would offer unlimited frequency selection, but required larger, heavier, more complex tuning mechanisms and provided less frequency stability. Crystal-controlled operation, where quartz crystal oscillators provided fixed, precise frequencies, offered instant channel switching with absolute frequency stability, but limited the radio to 4 pre-selected frequencies that could only be changed by replacing crystals, a maintenance operation requiring trained technicians and typically performed only between missions. Brown's team chose crystal control. The tactical advantage of instant, reliable channel switching outweighed the limitation of fixed frequencies. Fighter squadrons would operate on assigned frequencies known in advance. The 4-channel capability allowed pilots to monitor squadron frequency while having immediate access to group frequency, emergency frequency, and command frequency, covering all operationally necessary communications. The voice quality decision proved most consequential. Earlier military radios used amplitude modulation with relatively narrow bandwidth, resulting in acceptable but not excellent voice reproduction. The SCR-522 specification demanded telephone-quality voice communication, clear enough for pilots to recognize individual squadron mates by voice characteristics alone, reducing confusion during high-stress combat when multiple pilots might transmit simultaneously. Achieving this quality required wider bandwidth allocation and more sophisticated modulation circuits, increasing equipment complexity and power consumption. Brown's team implemented AM modulation optimized for voice frequencies, with bandwidth allocation of 100 kHz per channel, significantly wider than previous military voice radios. The power consumption increased to 115 watts during transmission, requiring electrical generation capacity that strained fighter aircraft electrical systems. North American Aviation had to upgrade the P-51's electrical generator from 12-volt 50-amp capacity to 24-volt 60-amp capacity specifically to support the SCR-522's power requirements, a weight penalty of approximately 8 pounds that reduced the aircraft's fuel capacity by roughly 4 gallons.
The justification seemed clear at the time. Combat effectiveness gained through reliable communication outweighed modest performance penalties from increased electrical system weight. Pilots who could coordinate attacks, share threat information, and call for help when in trouble would survive at higher rates than pilots fighting in isolation. The investment in communication capability would pay dividends in pilot survival rates and mission success rates. This design philosophy, accepting modest performance penalties to gain operational capabilities that enhanced survivability and effectiveness, reflected fundamental American military industrial thinking. German design philosophy typically optimized for maximum raw performance, accepting higher risk and lower survivability in exchange for superior speed, climb rate, or firepower. The P-51 Mustang with SCR-522 radio represented the opposite approach: good performance, excellent range, reliable communication, and integration into a coordinated fighting system. The first production SCR-522 units came off RCA's assembly line in Camden, New Jersey in March 1943. By June 1943, production reached 850 units per month. By December 1943, when the first P-51Bs entered combat in Europe, monthly production exceeded 2,000 units, and the radio equipped not just fighters, but bombers, transport aircraft, and rescue aircraft throughout the Army Air Forces. The SCR-522 became the standard VHF voice communication system for American military aviation, remaining in widespread service through the 1950s. The systematic exploitation of American communication superiority manifested across the European air campaign through 1944 and into 1945. On March 6, 1944, the date that opened this narrative,
The 354th Fighter Group provided the first P-51 escort to Berlin. The mission involved 658 B-17 bombers attacking ball-bearing plants and rail yards. Luftwaffe response was massive. An estimated 200-plus German fighters attacked throughout the mission. The P-51 escorts claimed 12 German fighters destroyed against 2 Mustangs lost. A 6-to-1 kill ratio achieved largely through coordinated defensive responses to German attacks, with pilots warning each other of threats and coordinating counterattacks via continuous radio communication. Luftwaffe Major Heinz Knoke, who participated in the defense, described the experience. The American fighters seemed to know where we would attack before we attacked. We assembled into formation to strike the bombers. The Mustangs immediately maneuvered to intercept us. We attempted to use altitude advantage. They climbed to meet us before we completed our positioning. Every attempted attack faced coordinated response. We scored few hits on the bombers and suffered heavy losses attempting to penetrate the fighter screen. The mathematics of attrition became relentless. On April 11, 1944, during an escort mission to aircraft plants near Rostock, P-51s from the 4th Fighter Group claimed 15 German fighters destroyed against 1 Mustang lost. On April 24, attacking Friedrichshafen, the 357th Fighter Group claimed 18 victories against 2 losses. On May 8, during attacks on oil facilities near Brunswick, the 352nd Fighter Group claimed 23 German aircraft destroyed, the highest single-day total for any fighter group in the war, against 3 Mustangs lost. Each engagement followed similar patterns. American pilots using radio communication to share threat information, coordinate attacks, and concentrate force against isolated German fighters. The accumulated toll became staggering. Between December 1943 and May 1944, a 6-month period covering the introduction of P-51 Mustangs to the intensification of daylight bombing operations, American fighter groups claimed 1,447 German aircraft destroyed in air combat, while losing 247 fighters. The overall exchange ratio of 5.86 to 1 reflected not individual pilot superiority, but systemic advantages in tactics, coordination, and communication. German pilots' personal accounts reveal the psychological impact of fighting against coordinated opponents. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Bendert, flying Bf-109s with II/JG3, wrote in a letter home dated June 3, 1944, "Every mission feels like flying into a trap. The Americans are always in position to counter our attacks. When we finally engage successfully, we find ourselves facing multiple opponents who coordinate their defensive maneuvers perfectly. I have survived 47 missions. Most of my original squadron is dead. We joke grimly that our life expectancy is measured in sorties remaining until the Americans find us." The Luftwaffe attempted various modifications to counter American coordination advantages. In May 1944, Reichsmarschall Göring ordered development of new radio protocols emphasizing increased communication between German fighter elements. The resulting directives reached operational units by June 1944, encouraging flight leaders to broadcast threat warnings and attack coordination information. But German pilots attempting to implement these protocols immediately encountered equipment limitations. The failure was comprehensively documented. On July 7, 1944, IIG-26 attempted to execute the new communication-intensive tactics during an engagement over France. After-action reports noted, flight leaders attempted to broadcast threat warnings and coordinate attacks via radio per new directives. Voice quality poor, many transmissions unintelligible, range insufficient. Pilots more than 5 kilometers apart could not maintain reliable contact.
Static interference severe above 7,000 meters. After 15 minutes, pilots reverted to visual signals and individual initiative tactics. Lost 8 aircraft. Claimed 2 American fighters destroyed. The exchange ratio of 4-to-1 against German forces demonstrated that communication-intensive tactics executed with inadequate equipment created worse outcomes than traditional German individual initiative doctrine. Late war desperation drove increasingly risky Luftwaffe operations. By January 1945, fuel shortages restricted German fighter operations to critical missions only. When flights launched, they often represented last-ditch attempts to prevent American bombers from obliterating German infrastructure. The communications disadvantage made these missions near suicidal. On February 3, 1945, during American attacks on Berlin, JG-300, equipped with heavily armed FW-190s optimized for bomber destruction, attempted to penetrate P-51 escort screens to reach the bombers. American fighters detected the German formation's approach via early radar warning, positioned themselves between the German fighters and bombers, and coordinated attacks that destroyed 23 FW-190s before the German pilots could engage a single bomber. The P-51 pilots used radio communication to assign specific targets, warn each other of threats, and coordinate pursuit of German survivors attempting to disengage. One particularly devastating example occurred on April 7, 1945, during one of the Luftwaffe's final large-scale operations. Approximately 120 German fighters attempted to attack American bombers striking Dresden. The 357th Fighter Group intercepted the German formation near Leipzig. Group Commander Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer coordinated his squadrons via radio, positioning flights to attack German formations from multiple directions simultaneously while cutting off escape routes. The engagement lasted 31 minutes. The 357th claimed 21 German aircraft destroyed. Meyer himself scored 5 kills, bringing his total to 24. Post-mission debriefing transcripts reveal continuous radio chatter throughout the engagement, threat warnings, target assignments, fuel state calls, ammunition status reports, coordination of pursuit tactics. From Meyer's mission report, excellent radio discipline throughout the engagement. Every pilot maintained situational awareness by monitoring squadron frequency. When blue flight became heavily engaged, I could redirect red and yellow flights to support them. When I called target assignments for the second attack wave, every pilot knew their role before visual contact with targets. The Germans never achieved this level of coordination. They fought as individuals. We fought as a team. That's why we won. The human cost to Luftwaffe forces became catastrophic. By April 1945, German fighter pilot training had been reduced to barely 100 hours total flight time, less than half the minimum considered necessary for combat readiness. Experienced pilots were dead, captured, or so depleted that their individual skill advantages no longer mattered against coordinated American tactics. The kill ratio shifted even more decisively in American favor. During the final 6 weeks of the war, P-51 units claimed approximately 800 German aircraft destroyed against roughly 40 Mustangs lost in air combat, a ratio exceeding 21-to-1. The most famous incident involving the communication advantage occurred on April 18, 1945, when Lieutenant Colonel Elwin Rigetti of the 55th Fighter Group, monitoring radio traffic while leading a strafing mission, heard an emergency call from a crippled B-17 requesting fighter escort. Rigetti directed his flight to the bomber's position via radio, coordinated with the bomber crew to determine their heading and altitude, positioned his fighters defensively, and escorted the bomber safely to Allied-controlled territory. The bomber crew survived because radio communication allowed rapid coordination between units that had never operated together, across distance that precluded visual contact in a situation requiring immediate response. German forces lacking equivalent communication capabilities could never have executed such spontaneous inter-unit coordination.
Production statistics for the P-51 Mustang document one of the most successful fighter aircraft programs in aviation history. North American Aviation delivered 15,586 P-51 Mustangs in all variants between 1941 and 1945. The distribution by major variant: 1,988 P-51A and A-36 Apache variants with Allison engines, 1,750 P-51B/C variants with Packard Merlin engines and the original Razorback canopy, 7,956 P-51D variants with the bubble canopy and increased armament, 1,337 P-51K variants manufactured at North American's Dallas plant, and smaller numbers of specialized variants, including reconnaissance and lightweight models. Of these, approximately 4,950 P-51s served in the European theater of operations with the 8th and 9th Air Forces. Every single aircraft carried the SCR-522 VHF radio as standard equipment, representing nearly 5,000 radios installed in operational fighters committed to combat operations over Europe. For comparison, RCA and Western Electric produced approximately 110,000 SCR-522 units during the war, equipping fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, and rescue aircraft across all American military aviation branches and several Allied air forces. The variant specifications demonstrate the evolution of the Mustang's capabilities. The P-51B, which entered combat in December 1943, featured the Packard V1650-3 Merlin engine producing 1,380 horsepower, maximum speed of 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, service ceiling of 42,000 feet, combat range of 950 miles with internal fuel or 1,600 miles with drop tanks, armament of 4 .50 caliber machine guns with 350 rounds per gun. But weight: 9,200 pounds loaded, of which 60 pounds was the SCR-522 radio installation. The P-51D, which became the most numerous variant and entered service in mid-1944, featured the upgraded Packard V1650-7 Merlin engine producing 1,695 horsepower, maximum speed of 437 miles per hour, slightly reduced due to increased weight, service ceiling of 41,900 feet, similar range, increased armament of 6.50 machine guns, and the distinctive bubble canopy providing 360-degree visibility. Weight increased to 10,100 pounds loaded. The radio installation remained 60 pounds, now representing a smaller percentage of total weight but still present in every aircraft. Loss rates reveal the Mustang's combat effectiveness. Of approximately 4,950 P-51s delivered to European theater units, combat losses totaled roughly 2,520 aircraft. However, only 843 of these were lost in air-to-air combat. The remainder fell to ground fire, accidents, mechanical failure, and operational causes. The kill ratio of 5.87 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed per P-51 lost in air combat represents one of the highest exchange ratios achieved by any fighter aircraft in any conflict. Crew casualties tell a more sobering story. Each lost P-51 represented one pilot killed, captured, or wounded. Approximately 843 pilots lost in air combat, with additional casualties from operational losses bringing the total to roughly 2,100 pilots lost or permanently removed from combat duty. However, the survival rate for American fighter pilots in Europe far exceeded that of German pilots.
Of American fighter pilots who completed combat tours, typically 50 missions in 1944, later increased to 70 missions, approximately 70% survived to return home. German fighter pilots faced far bleaker odds. By 1944, German fighter pilot life expectancy averaged roughly 30 combat missions before death or serious injury. Survivor testimony provides context to these statistics. Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions in P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group and achieved 16.25 aerial victories, described the radio's importance in his memoir. The SCR-522 wasn't glamorous. Nobody wrote home about their radio. But it kept us alive. Every mission, I knew I could call for help and my squadron would hear me. I could warn my wingman about threats he couldn't see. I could coordinate with flight leaders I couldn't see visually. That radio made us infinitely more effective than if we'd been flying alone. It was as important as our guns, our engines, our fuel tanks, maybe more important because it connected us as a team. Major George Preddy, the top-scoring P-51 ace with 26.83 aerial victories before his death in December 1944, noted in a letter to his family, "German pilots are brave, skilled, and determined. Their aircraft are excellent, but they fight as individuals while we fight as teams. Our radios let us coordinate attacks that would be impossible with hand signals alone. We can warn each other, help each other, work together seamlessly. That's the difference between victory and defeat in modern air combat." The comparative analysis with German equipment starkly illustrates the technical gap.
Der Fug 16ZÜ, Standard Luftwaffe Fighter Radio, operierte in der High-Frequenzband 38,5 bis 42,3 MHz. Provised single-channel operation requiring manual tuning between frequencies, delivered voice quality beschrieben als adäquat but not excellent, mit signifikanter Static Interference above 20.000 feet und offerte ein effektiven Reich von approximativ 30 Meilen unter Idealkonditionen, oft reduziert auf 15 bis 20 Meilen in Combat Conditions mit atmosphärischer Interferenz. Die philosophische Differenz dies repräsentierte, kann nicht übersteht werden. Amerikanische Doktrin embracete das Prinzip, dass Airborne-Forcen operierten als integrierte Systeme, wo Informationssharing multiplizierte Combat-Effektivität. Piloten, die wissen, was ihre Teamkameraden wissen, konnten komplexe Taktiken, abtauchen vor Developing Threats und konzentrieren Force dezisive. Dies requierte accepting weight penalties von advanced radio equipment, elektrische System-Upgrades zu power das Equipment und taktische Doktrin emphasizing Kommunikation over radio silence. German doctrine emphasized individual pilot initiative, strict radio discipline zu präventieren enemy intelligence gathering through communications monitoring und Taktiken basierend auf briefed plans executed through visual signals und personal judgment. Dies Doktrin wirkte brillant in earlier war phases, wenn German pilots possessed superior training, Experience-Vorteile und oft numerische Superiorität. But by 1944, facing American pilots with adequate training, roughly equivalent aircraft performance, numerical superiority und vastly superior tactical communication capabilities, individual initiative doctrine proved catastrophically inadequate. The survival statistics tell the final story. American fighters operating mit der SCR-522 achieved the 5.87:1 kill ratio documented earlier. American bomber crews, protected by fighters koordinierend ihre defensive efforts via radio, suffered loss rates of approximativ 2 bis 3% per Mission bei Mid-1944, down von 5 bis 6% before long-range escort became standard.
Die Ability von Fighter Pilots zu kommunizieren miteinander, mit Bomberformationen, mit Air-Sea Rescue Aircraft und mit Ground Controllers created eine web of mutuale support that enhanced survival at every level. Germany's inability to match diese Kapazität stemmed from industrial constraints, taktischer Doktrinrigidität und Failure to recognize Kommunikationstechnologie als eine decisive Capability Multiplier until too late. Bei der Zeit Luftwaffe-Intelligenz identifizierte amerikanische Radiokommunikation als eine kritische Avantage in Mit-1944, Germany lackte Time, Resources und industrielle Kapazität zu entwickeln äquivalente Systeme und retrain Pilots in kommunikationsintensive Taktiken.
The examination of P-51B serial number 4312434 at Debden Airfield on March 6, 1944, the aircraft that opened this narrative, provided Master Sergeant Robert Chen with physical evidence of the communication advantage that would help win the air war over Europe. That advantage wasn't obvious, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't appear in aircraft specification sheets as maximum speed, or armament, or service ceiling. It occupied 60 pounds of weight and 3 cubic feet of space behind the pilot's seat, but it transformed how American fighter pilots fought. By May 8, 1945, VE Day, the Luftwaffe had been swept from European skies. The final tally showed American fighter units had destroyed approximately 6,000 German aircraft in air combat while losing roughly 1,000 fighters to enemy action. The P-51 Mustang accounted for 4,950 of those German losses, nearly half the total, while representing only a portion of American fighter strength. The kill ratio remained consistent. For every Mustang lost in air combat, nearly 6 German aircraft fell. The irony is perfect and profound. Luftwaffe pilots respected the Mustang's performance, feared its range, and acknowledged its pilot quality. German intelligence officers analyzed captured Mustangs, documented their specifications, studied their tactical employment. But until captured American pilots revealed the truth in interrogation, German commanders never fully comprehended that the decisive advantage wasn't visible in the airframe. It existed in the constant radio chatter that connected every American fighter pilot to every other pilot within 50 miles, turning individual aircraft into nodes in a coordinated network where information flowed instantly and tactics adapted continuously. The lesson extended far beyond World War II. Modern fighter doctrine, with AWACS coordination providing battlefield surveillance, data link systems sharing targeting information between aircraft, and network-centric warfare connecting every combat unit into integrated systems, traces its conceptual origins directly to those Mustang pilots talking constantly over their SCR-522 radios. The principle remains unchanged. In military operations, information superiority creates force multiplication beyond raw capability advantages. The fighter pilot who knows what his teammates know, who can warn and be warned, who can coordinate and be coordinated with, who can call for help and respond to calls for help, that pilot survives at higher rates and fights more effectively than any pilot fighting alone, regardless of individual skill or aircraft performance. The Germans never lacked brave pilots. They never lacked capable aircraft. They never lacked tactical innovation or strategic determination. What they lacked, fatally, was the industrial capacity, doctrinal flexibility, and technological integration to match American information-sharing capabilities. By the time they recognized radio communication as a decisive capability multiplier, the war was already lost. Germany's industrial base was collapsing under strategic bombing. Fuel shortages grounded what fighters remained. Pilot training had deteriorated to dangerous inadequacy.
No amount of tactical radio communication could reverse strategic defeat. But the counterfactual remains compelling. Had Luftwaffe fighters equivalent communication equipment from the war's beginning, had German doctrine embraced information sharing rather than radio silence, had German pilots fought as coordinated teams rather than skilled individuals, the air war over Europe might have followed a far different trajectory. American bombers might have faced defenses that adapted in real time to their formations, fighters that coordinated attacks to overwhelm escorts, defenses that concentrated force decisively at critical points. The casualty rates that made strategic bombing nearly unbearable, even with communication advantages, might have become completely unsustainable against defenders possessing equivalent coordination capabilities. The examination of that SCR-522 radio at Debden on March 6, 1944, revealed more than technical specifications. It revealed a fundamental principle of modern warfare. Capability integration matters more than isolated performance advantages. Coordinated teams defeat superior individuals, and information dominance transforms tactical engagements into systematic victories. The P-51 Mustang became legendary not solely because it was fast, long-range, and well-armed, though it was all those things, but because it served as the platform for a communication system that made American fighter pilots infinitely more effective than the sum of their individual parts.
Wars are won not by isolated heroes, but by connected teams sharing one critical advantage: knowing what their teammates know. The SCR-522 VHF radio, weighing 60 pounds and occupying 3 cubic feet behind the pilot's seat, represented that advantage in physical form. And in that single fact lies the entire story of how American fighter pilots achieved air superiority over Europe. Not through individual brilliance, but through systematic coordination enabled by technology, doctrine, and the simple act of talking to each other while they fought.